At 9:47 a.m, the first tractor rolled down Whitehall, big, loud, completely out of place. Then came another one, then another, and then suddenly there were 50 of them. The police tried to block the route. The tractors kept coming. Now, Westminster has seen protests before, plenty of them. Angry crowds, clever placards, people shouting slogans they'd forgotten by tea time. Most of them go home before dinner. This wasn't that. These weren't professional protesters, no matching jackets, no megaphones handed out by organisers. These were men and women who wake up before dawn every day to grow food, people who don't shout for a living. And that's when it hit me. They weren't here to be heard. They were here because they'd run out of ways to ask politely. As the tractors filled the street, you could feel it. This wasn't noise, it was weight. The weight of people who'd been ignored for too long. People who'd finally decided that if nobody in power would come to the countryside, then the countryside would come to them. And before you decide what you think about this, stay with me, because what brought them here wasn't a slogan or a stunt or a celebrity. It was a single decision that would change everything. People like to say this all started because I'm famous, that I'm rich, that I got bored and decided to play farmer for television. And if you've watched me over the years, you'd be forgiven for thinking I'd eventually wander off to the next shiny distraction, cars, columns, causing trouble, that sort of thing. I certainly didn't wake up one morning thinking, right, today I'll take on the government. I'm Jeremy Clarkson, not a politician. I don't do committees. I don't do careful language. And I definitely don't do pretending. But a few years ago, I bought a farm in the Cotswolds. Not as a joke, not as a costume. I bought it because I wanted to see if I could actually do it. And very quickly, farming taught me something brutal. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care what you've earned, what you've driven, or how many people recognize you at airports. The weather doesn't care, the soil doesn't care, the bank doesn't care. You work, you lose money, you work harder, you lose some more, and if you're lucky, you survive. So when that tax was announced, I didn't hear it as a headline. I heard it as a death sentence, because I knew exactly what a farm looks like on paper, and I knew exactly what it looks like in real life. And for the first time, I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't a policy aimed at people like me. It was aimed at people who couldn't walk away. And once you see that, staying quiet stops being an option. They stood up in Parliament and announced it like it was housekeeping, sensible, responsible, necessary. An inheritance tax of 20% on agricultural land valued above £1 million. Close a loophole. Make the wealthy pay their fair share. On paper, it sounded tidy, almost moral, nods all round. Job done. Except paper has never ploughed a field. Because here's the bit they didn't say out loud. A farm can be worth £2 or £3 million on paper and still make £30,000 a year, if you're lucky. That isn't wealth you spend, it's land you work. It's mud and machinery and debt and weather that hates you. It's a business where one bad season can wipe out 3 good ones. And when the owner dies, the value on that bit of paper suddenly turns into a bill. A very real bill. 20% of £3 million isn't a theory. It's £600,000, sometimes £200,000, sometimes £800,000. Money that simply does not exist in a family farm's bank account. So the children inherit a choice that isn't a choice at all. Sell the land and kill the farm, or keep the farm and go bankrupt trying to pay the tax. That's when I stopped listening to the speeches and started thinking about people I actually know. Dairy farmers, arable farmers, families who've worked the same land for generations, farms that look rich to someone in an office but are one breakdown away from collapse. These aren't tax dodgers, they're grafters, and they were being told politely that their way of life was collateral damage. They said it would only hit the richest farmers. Anyone who's ever set foot on a farm knows that's nonsense. Land values have exploded, incomes haven't. You don't need to be rich to cross £1 million anymore. You just need to have stayed put long enough. And that's the moment the knot tightened, because this wasn't about fairness. It was about people who don't understand farming, making decisions for people who can't escape it. And once you see that, the word policy starts to sound an awful lot like a threat. I didn't plan a campaign. I didn't ring anyone up. I didn't sit in a room working out messaging. I just said it the only way I know how. I said they were taxing tractors, taxing barns, taxing the land your grandfather's grandfather worked. And I said that when you can't pay, they'll make you sell usually to developers who'll build houses nobody can afford. That was it. No script, no polish, just the truth, said plainly. The clip went out and within hours it had millions of views. Not because I'm clever, but because people understood it immediately. Farming policy stopped being a paragraph at the back of the news and became a kitchen table conversation. You could see it turning. Messages started coming in, not from activists, from farmers, from people who'd never been on a march in their lives, people asking the same question, what do we do now? The government's first response was to shrug. Celebrity jumping on a cause. He'll get bored, he'll move on. They badly misjudged that, because this wasn't about me. It was about people who'd stopped trusting politicians and suddenly heard someone say out loud what they'd been muttering in yards and sheds for weeks. So they organised themselves, not through unions or committees, through phones, WhatsApp groups, social media. A simple message passed around, London, November 19th, bring your tractor. When that day came, they expected a few hundred. They got more than 10,000. Tractors from Scotland, Wales, the north, the southwest, roads blocked, Westminster, stunned. And standing there, looking at that crowd, I realised something else. This had stopped being a complaint. It had become a movement. And once that happens, it doesn't quietly go away. Once they realised the tractors weren't going home, the tone changed. Suddenly, this wasn't concern, it was suspicion. Briefings went out. Off the record, of course. Many of these protesters aren't real farmers. This is astroturfing. Rich landowners using ordinary people as cover. The implication was obvious. This wasn't a grassroots revolt. It was a trick. So I did the simplest thing imaginable. I stopped talking and let farmers talk instead. I brought them into television studios that usually prefer polished spokespeople with tidy hair and safe answers. These weren't that. These were people with mud on their boots and worry on their faces. A third-generation dairy farmer staring at a potential £800,000 inheritance tax bill. A family that's worked the same land since the 1600s, now being told it might end on their watch. A young farmer who knows that no matter how hard he works, he'll never be able to afford to inherit his parents' farm. One woman said she works 80 hours a week and earns less than the minimum wage. Her farm is worth a couple of million on paper. When her father dies, she'll owe hundreds of thousands she simply doesn't have. Watching her say it out loud, you could see something shift. This wasn't theory anymore. This was a sentence being passed on people who had done nothing wrong. The accusation that these were millionaire tax dodgers collapsed in real time. These weren't the people hiding money. These were the people everyone claims to respect. Hard-working, quiet, essential. And they were furious, not because they wanted special treatment, but because they were being sacrificed by people who'd never set foot on a farm. From that moment on, the argument changed. It stopped being about spreadsheets and loopholes and started being about fairness in the real world. And that's a dangerous place for any government to be, because once the public sees faces instead of figures, you don't get to dismiss them anymore. Up to that point, it was easy for people in power to pretend this was noise. Tractors were inconvenient, interviews were awkward, but life carried on. So the farmers decided to show what happens when farming doesn't. They announced a national strike. One day, no food deliveries to supermarkets in London and the major cities, just one day, to make a point. The response from government was instant, irresponsible, blackmail, punishing ordinary people. I heard all of it. And I kept thinking the same thing. This wasn't blackmail. This was reality, briefly exposed. You can ignore farming when the shelves are full. You can't when they aren't. The strike went ahead. Lorries stayed put. Deliveries stopped. And by the afternoon, supermarket shelves were empty in places you'd never expect. Milk gone, fresh produce gone. Suddenly, people who'd never thought about agriculture in their lives were asking why it had come to this. Some blamed the farmers. Others asked a more uncomfortable question. What kind of policy drives the people who feed you to desperation? That was the turning point. because this stopped being a rural issue. It crossed the line into everyday life. Polls began to shift. Rural support for the government collapsed. Then something more worrying happened for number 10. Urban voters started siding with the farmers, not because they loved tractors, but because they understood family businesses, inheritance, being forced to sell what you've built because someone in an office decided it looked valuable on paper. The government tried to explain percentages, thresholds, reassurances, but they were losing the argument because while they spoke in abstractions, the country was staring at empty shelves. Farming was no longer invisible, and once people see how fragile the system really is, they don't forget it. A year after the tractors first rolled in, the language changed. Quietly, carefully, no speeches about surrender, no apologies, just a statement delivered at the dispatch box about refinements, higher thresholds, longer payment terms, broader exemptions. The sort of words politicians use when they want to move on without saying why. They insisted this had always been the plan, that they were listening, that nothing fundamental had changed. Everyone watching knew that wasn't true, because those refinements did something very specific. They pushed the thresholds so high that most family farms were suddenly safe. They stretched the payment terms so far that the bills could actually be managed. They carved out exemptions so wide that the policy, as it was announced, no longer existed in any meaningful way. Call it what you like, adjustment, review, listening, exercise. It was a retreat. I didn't cheer, I didn't claim a medal. I just sat on the farm and allowed myself a rare smile. Not because I'd beaten anyone, but because British farming hadn't been quietly sacrificed. This wasn't a victory for a television presenter. It was a victory for people who refused to shut up when they were told politely that their livelihoods were expendable. But the damage didn't vanish with the policy. Trust doesn't come back that easily. Rural support was shattered, authority was dented, and a lesson had been written in very large letters across Westminster. You can manage Parliament, you can spin the media, but when you dismiss real people with real grievances, eventually they will find a voice loud enough to reach you. I never wanted political power. I still don't. All I did was speak plainly about something I understood and refused to move out of the way, and that turned out to be enough. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If this could happen once, it can happen again. Next time a policy looks tidy on paper and disastrous in real life, who do you listen to? The people with spreadsheets, or the people with dirt under their fingernails? If you think this story matters, if you think it says something bigger about power, politics, and who actually gets heard, then stay with the channel, share this video, and keep paying attention. Because the moment people stop listening is the moment decisions like this get made again.